for Africa. We have Philip Orleang, who's the ED at AFD, Jenny Bates, Director General at FCDO, Maria Shaw-Barragan, who's Director at European Investment Bank, and of course Mr. Damu Ravi, who's the Secretary Economic Relations at the Ministry of External Affairs, India. So, navigating the debt crisis, I think
this is one issue which, whether you are in the private world or in the public world or in the development world, this is a key issue which is on minds of many of us. Coming out of the debt crisis, coming out of the COVID crisis, now which has been accentuated with what is happening geopolitically, we talk about factors which have been disrupting the world, whether it is inequality, whether it is age disruptions, technology, so on and so forth. We see that countries across the globe are suffering from a huge amount of debt that they have piled up. We have seen some countries like Sri Lanka most recently missing their debt payments. We have seen countries like Ghana who actually have almost debt at 93% of the GDP, which has actually grown 40% the previous year. We have seen the global debt at $300 trillion, and that's almost 349% of the global GDP. So the numbers are astounding. We also see countries like Lebanon who have had to devalue their currencies for the first time in 25 years. We see countries like Bangladesh, which had a reasonably stable currency regime and who have seen 23% devaluation in recent times, and even then whether the currency is fairly valued is a question mark. And of course, we keep hearing as to how the US is doing and whether they are in a debt spiral as well. So that's the magnitude of the problem that the world faces at this point in time. Now, this is further accentuated by many transitions that the world wishes to do, whether it is trying to turn green, which also has a cost. You can't, everything has a cost, so turning green has a cost. And that only means that the difference between the haves and the have-nots, or the inequality in the world, needs further review and assessment. Now, what's the solution? And hopefully we'll get some ideas today in the time that we have today. Whether it is going to be the role of the multilateral lending organizations, whether it is private credit, whether it is the way we disseminate credit, or maybe something else which will come through. I think many of those questions are on the minds of many. So without further ado, let me actually start. And the first question really, Jenny, I'll come to you. We're talking about enhanced debt levels. That's been established, right? And governments across the world are trying to now balance sovereignty, which is a big issue, with the need for investment for the future. Is that even possible?
Thanks very much. Welcome. Really pleased to be here today. The last time I was in Delhi, I spoke to the Raisina Young Diplomats Forum, and it's really good to see some of the young colleagues here at the event today. I was going to make 5 quick points on this. The first, I think, is an important point to get on the table, and a simple one, but it's worth remembering that debt itself is not a bad thing, and that actually the ability to borrow to invest is the cornerstone of a successful nation. I was raised as a Treasury official early in my career and very much taught that, but actually the ability to bring forward that investment that wouldn't occur if you couldn't borrow. So it's not debt per se that is the issue, it's how we manage it. The second thing I would say is that in thinking about the balance of sovereignty and borrowing is that we need to focus very much on instrument choice. There are different ways of having investment in countries. We can have different levels of concessionality in that lending, and certainly from a UK perspective, we very much look to focus the more concessional instruments or indeed the grant financing on those partners with lower capacity to borrow, and as countries move up the income spectrum and have more access to capital markets and higher levels of tax revenues, you're looking at the less concessional instruments. So you need to be thinking about which kind of instrument you're using. The third thing I would say is that there's a key piece in here about capacity and policy frameworks. Having the right ability to raise tax revenue and supporting countries in their ability to do that, debt management capability. A lot of the technical assistance that we provide from the UK is focused on strengthening the ability of countries to manage accessing capital markets and accessing that kind of borrowing. Maybe to get at some of the slightly more complex issues though, 2 other points. So the fourth is that
there is, in the end, I think, a balance between the creditor and the borrower in all debt relationships. And we need to think about who's bearing the risk and how we are sharing that risk to some extent. So one of the things that we've been doing, for example, in this region from the UK, is we have a new initiative with ASEAN, a catalytic green finance initiative, which is about de-risking and reducing the cost of some of the investment through the Asian Development Bank, where the UK is putting in funding to make that borrowing cheaper, but also putting in technical assistance alongside. We're also using guarantee instruments more from the UK, which involves essentially the UK taxpayer bearing more of the risk of investments that we're making. And similarly in that space, I am, in our system, the shareholder in our structure for British International Investment, which is our development finance institution, which invests in the private sector, so borrowing by companies. And I consistently tell them to take more risk because I want them to be investing in places where the private market at the moment is not going. So that balance of who's bearing the risk, I think, matters. And then I think last point, the long history of being a creditor nation from the UK is that things will go wrong. In all creditor borrowing and lending relationships, you will have moments where there is no longer an ability to service that borrowing. So you need mechanisms to manage that, whether that is the Paris Club that comes together with private creditors. But one example I just wanted to mention was that the UK has been leading some work through our export finance agency on climate resilient debt clauses. And the point about this is that you pause repayment during a climate shock. And so there are ways to build into the debt relationship management of that risk. Thanks.
Thank you, Jenny. So Vera, I'll come to you. You know, the crisis that we have been experiencing over the last 3 years has impacted the developing nations a lot more. And at the same time, we all keep talking about the future, whether it is our children, the investment in education and healthcare and so on and so forth. What's really been the impact on the developing nations? And you know, when we talk about sustainable goals, because they ought to be part of supply chains of the future, how can they balance the varying needs that they have with the nation with the need for well-being for their own citizens?
Thank you very much. This is my first time at the Rechanneling Dialogue, so I'm very happy to be here, and I must thank all the organizers for making it possible. I think two things, and let me just pick up from where Jenny left off. First of all, debt is not bad, and so I fully agree with you on that. But what is even more important is the cost of debt. And towards the end of the presentation, she talked about buying down the cost of debt for Indian private sector. And I think that's also what the African continent is looking for accessible debt. You know, just before the COVID crisis hit, Professor Dornbush essentially said that we could go and borrow ourselves to death because, you know, there were negative interest rates in Japan and Germany, and so there was sort of the future was bright and we could do as much as we wanted to. This is true for the developed economies. For the developing economies, market access is almost prohibitive. And so if you're an investment grade borrower, you borrow at 200 basis points. If you are a frontier economy, you're borrowing at 1,200 basis points. So if you as a frontier economy and a developed economy went to the market the same day and started building the same energy plant, you would fall into a debt crisis within 3 years because you cannot afford it. And so I think one of the most important things we need to do is get blended financing and say, how can we, and that's what Jenny was talking about, is how can we blend? And what do you use the resources for? And that's your question. Is there's a whole group of sort of, you know, social services, education, health. With the COVID crisis, we saw the need for additional social protection. And that needs concessional grant resources. But we know that we can do, you know, productive, actually, there has not been a default in any energy plant on the continent, even despite the crisis. There have been some that didn't start, but there has not been an outright default because it is good business. to invest on the continent. And my sense is if we can see how we reduce the cost of borrowing so that we can actually put the infrastructure in faster. And as we know, if you have better infrastructure, more girls go to school, water is cleaner, you reduce the cost of healthcare. So it's a circular economy, right? You know, you need to do some of the infrastructure that the private sector needs to come in to do to make the social services that one wants to provide more affordable and easy. Of course, there is always the last mile, as you said, and for that we still need grant financing that is going to be able to, the last mile is the rural areas, the lagging regions, as we will call them in this part of the world, where we need still a lot of grant funding. But I think with the opportunities that we have today around climate and carbon markets, we can actually raise a little bit more resources to meet that. But it comes back to the cost of financing through the private sector, but also the need through the public sector, through the multilateral development banks, to have more of the International Development Association either go to grant economies that are still low income, and for the multilateral development banks to ensure that the middle income countries, because remember that the poor today, we have more poor in middle income countries than we have in low income countries. So even they need accessible, affordable financing to make sure that they can take care of those and meet the MDG goals, the SDG goals.
Thanks, Mera. So Maria, I'll come to you. We've been seeing in more recent times that multilateralism, while it stays, there is a lot more focus on what I can do in-house, like Atmanirbhar. What can I do in-house, or maybe bilateral. We have seen a rise in FTAs and so on and so forth, which means that there is country-to-country cooperation, which could mean any two countries, right? Now, how does it really impact the developing nations who at times may not be really part of these blocks?
Thank you. Thank you very much for the question, and I'm really happy to be part of this panel. But I also want to congratulate the audience. It's a beautiful morning, Saturday morning in Delhi, and you're here. So you really, it means that you're really interested in this topic. So we owe you a good panel here. To your question, we have seen, so self-reliance is one of the solutions that we need to put more in place. But this will not replace multilateralism. And what we have seen is that the main challenges that we are confronted with now are global challenges. We are not out of a global health crisis, and this would not be solved by becoming much more inward-looking or just looking at the solutions within a single country. We need to find global solutions to this challenge, and if we look at the global climate change challenge, clearly it is not going to be solved at national level, even in very big and very important nations. So working with what are your own capacities, diversifying sources of in your value chains, but working at multilateral level, it is going to be essential. And in this sense, there is also the need to create new ways of having partnerships that can be with bilaterals, with blocs, partnerships with the private sector. We need to bring the private sector to be part of the discussion and part of the solution. We've talked about bonds. Often it is the private sector that is holding those, very often also institutional investors. So bringing everyone to the table is what we need. It is not one solution or the other, but it's the combination of all of them.
Thanks, Maria. So, Mr. Ravi, if I'll come to you, there are a few emerging development partnership models which have come in. I think the question really is that do they really prioritize the asks of the recipient countries, or really they're focusing on the geopolitical vision, if I may call it so, of the donor countries? Is there a balance? Can there be a balance?
Yeah. Thank you, Sanjeev, for that question, and I also thank Raisina Dialogue for this opportunity to be here with you all. This is a very important and interesting question for us. If you look at our own development assistance to countries, India is both a recipient and a donor. But we believe that it is the recipient countries' interests, their priorities that matter in the way we look at development assistance to other countries. Now, we have done this since even our assistance to developing countries, it predates our independence. At the post-independence, we enhance that support. In the form of capacity building. We've, since 1964, when we started this Indian Technical Economic Cooperation Program, we've trained about 500,000 experts. So what we believe is that it is important to create value at the local level. Then we enhanced our support in the form of lines of credit, grants. But if you look at all of our projects, most of them are long-term. They create local value, and we really look at the interest and the priorities of the recipient country. Now, so in the last 2 decades, we introduced digital technologies to reach out to a large number of people around the world in terms of education. So the e-Vidya Bharati scheme has become, e-education concepts using digital technologies have become very, very useful to many countries, and we want to expand on that scale. Now, we've been thinking mostly development assistance in the form of South-South paradigm, but I think time has come for us to scale it up into the South and North together can work in developing countries to expand the scale of outreach, development assistance programs and projects. And this is very important because of the post-COVID scenario and the geopolitical tensions that is causing uncertainties. And I believe in the days to come, the healthcare, medical care, food security, energy transition issues will become very, very vital. It's also important for us to look at doing projects in the days more with the private sector, pushing them in the front, and less on the government guarantees concept, because that takes away the revenue generation locally and enhances the debt of those countries. So we look at in the concessional financing arrangements, blended financing arrangements, and push the private sector into the front to do these projects. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. So we're talking about concessional financing and involvement of the private sector, but Philip, let me now come to you. You know, many countries are missing their debt obligations, and they're being challenged, there are negotiations going on with IMF and others. You know, the role of the official development assistance, I mean, how do you think this will change in times to come? And, you know, do they need to reprioritize?
Thank you very much. Actually, I'm not sure so many countries are missing on their obligations. There have been a number of cases that have been attracted a lot of attention. But if, for instance, we look at the AFD portfolio globally, we operate in 110 countries. I cannot say that many countries are missing on their obligations. Actually, it's quite the contrary. A number of countries are fulfilling their obligation in spite of harsher conditions. That's number one. Number two, coming now to your issue of how can ODA best answer to these challenges. First one is that financing from external financing should certainly try to support primarily domestic financial sectors. And not enough is being done by the so-called donor community. We at the AFD try to work as much as we can with domestic financial system, because this is one of the way when you are financial institutions like us to leverage and also to reach out to a larger number of beneficiaries of partners. For instance, to give you an idea, we've just signed in India a non-sovereign credit line with SBI. And what we will be doing through our work with SBI will have a much greater impact than what we could achieve working alone. That's number one, strengthening of domestic financial system and supporting, here again, initiative that we've taken in India, the greening of the financial system, because this is the way to sort of make coincide your objectives in terms of our objectives and India's objectives in terms of climate and in terms of resilience of the financial system. Third issue, increase non-sovereign lending or non-sovereign activities. Too often, the menu that is available in financial institutions is sovereign lending, full stop, which is the less risky business and the one for which there has been a proliferation of actors, but they all do the same. They do sovereign lending in foreign currency. We are of the view that there should be more actors doing non-sovereign lending, including to the public sector, lending to municipality. Mrs. Yellen, a few weeks back, directed a speech she made to the World Bank, said, why are you not doing municipal lending, for instance? We do municipal lending, this is non-sovereign lending, and it is not a particularly risky business. We don't have any single case of default in municipal lending, for instance, to give you an idea. And this needs to be expanded. Cities are clearly a target. Public utilities, for instance, in Indonesia, where we partnering to support the Just Energy Transition Partnership that the country has launched, we will be working with Indonesian public utilities, and we're trying to do the same thing in India. And the third point is to rally the public development banks of all the countries that do have, which is the majority of the countries in the globe, to make them work more closely on the development/climate agenda. There are 5, this is another fact that is often, not too often mentioned in the conversation. There are 500, probably more, public development banks around the world, totaling 1.5 trillion investment annually, representing between 12 and 15% of the world global investment. This is one category of public actors that can really make a difference through what they're doing and through the way they're reaching out to the private sector. And you can see that with 1.5 trillion, if you manage to shift 10 or 15% of that towards green financing, climate finance, or other aspects of the SDG agenda, then the impact is 10 times bigger than whatever you can do with ODA.
Thanks, Philip. Jenny, if I can come to you, this is not the first debt crisis that you have been dealing with. So, what from your experience would be the learnings that we can carry through as we face this one, and how do we marry that focus with the development agenda that all of us have?
I think that's a great question. So I was going to talk just briefly about two examples. I mean, the UK, as I mentioned, has a long history of being a creditor nation, but I think this is also why we've been so engaged on the debt and development nexus over the last couple of decades. So one example, I think, is the lessons from the Asia financial crisis. When I started my career in the Treasury, that was the set of issues that we were dealing with. And just two things I think that have come out, but just to underscore them. One is trying to find ways to enable countries to borrow more in their domestic currency. That is a way of balancing the risk, and it's also a way of deepening capital markets. And I think that was one of the lessons. I think the other lesson from that experience was that it really, this point about diversifying who you are lending to so that you have a wider range of actors. It's not just sovereign lending, you're lending into the private sector, you have a much more diverse set of borrowers, and I think colleagues have mentioned that, but those were certainly lessons, I think, from that example. Turning to the sort of debt issue when it becomes a problem, looking back at what we learned from the HIPIC experience, which is the Heavily Indebted Poor Countries Initiative many years ago, which was a very successful way of dealing with a historical stock of debt. I think there are a couple of things to say on that. One was very much the approach of not seeing this as something that was a problem solely for the debtor nations. This was something that we collectively as creditors and debtors needed to come together, and a sense of almost sort of moral purpose that we shared, that we needed to address this issue. I think there was also a real focus on addressing the debt and giving the relief, but linking it to constructive development. So linking it to the policy reforms that were happening in country, ensuring that we didn't go down the same path again. And just repeat another load of lending in another environment that would get you back to where you were. So this sort of policy environment and capacity piece, I think, was a real lesson. And the third point, I think, and this is very relevant now, is that it needed to be a collective action. All of the creditors needed to come together. And we now live in a world of a much more diverse and broad set of creditors. And I think, looking at particularly people have been talking about China in this forum, we are going to need to find ways to engage more constructively with China as a creditor. We think the work in the G20 on the common framework has been really important, but if we're going to have successful dealing with debt challenges going forward, it's going to need to be a genuine collective action that all parties are coming to the table on, and we need to make sure we're continuing to press all partners to do that.
Thanks, Jenny. Mr. Ravi, Jenny spoke about domestic currency borrowings, and one of the questions that comes to mind is that are there innovative mechanisms that some of the countries could really put in place to avoid this debt burden that they have? And we always keep speaking about the world around us. Jenny referred to China as well, and we're talking about green transition. Are there any other mechanisms which can help us solve for this? That's for you.
Yeah. So thank you, Sanjeev. So been thinking about it. If you look at today the debt restructuring issues, which is the multilateral banks are looking at in terms of DSS and CCRTs and the common framework. Now you're basically addressing the hard currency issue here. We're trying to let the countries to still how cope up in terms of the repayments in the hard currency. I think we need to look at it somewhat differently and innovatively. Can we encourage countries to do greater trading in their own currencies? Then, the dependency on the hard currency should reduce, and that will enable countries to continue to do trading, economic activities in their own currency. The another thing is the multilateral institutions can also help developing capital markets in those countries. Now, we haven't thought in terms of developing the government securities, how do you utilize them, the bond markets, the infrastructure bonds. Therein comes in the capacity, education, training to be able to develop the local products so that the countries are able to tap their own resources to do their own infrastructure projects or even development projects. The other thing that I would very much strongly put forward, the idea is the interoperability, the universal payment interoperability concept. Now this is a seamless transaction facility that it provides and extremely useful developing countries, and the costs are low, and it's only you need to have the digital architecture in place, which is again a very low cost solution. So therein comes in the cooperation amongst countries to be able to do it. Now this is something new, but we have to start to think if we can apply ourselves to encouraging countries to do these kind of products, it will be extremely useful. The fourth element I would think is actually encourage manufacturing in the countries, because if you are doing projects, this are long term, that's a very important because they're also very development oriented, but we haven't thought again creating value locally. And that is important because countries have to be self-sustaining, then the manufacturing has to happen in the local area. And this is again, private sector can come in greatly. And what private sector needs at that point is actually concessional financing. And that is again, one has to find a way to support those kind of operations with risk mitigation, government guarantees on those kind of activities. And then you see activity picking up over a period of time and making those countries self-sufficient. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Ravi. So Vera, I'll come to you. I mean, some suggestions have already come in. In fact, I have a page full of suggestions. But if we can embrace some of these, do you believe that we can get to the SDG goals faster, particularly those relating to poverty, inequality, and so on and so forth?
No, thank you. I think 4 things. The first one, going back again to develop, we need the resources. And when you introduced me, you said I was at the UN. I'm no longer at the UN. But one of the things I'm doing, what I'm doing now is I created an institution which will provide liquidity. And this is an important point. We conflate liquidity with debt. And so if you think about, the 44 days in the UK when, interest rates went off the roof and even the UK government could not service its debt, what happened is the Bank of England gave the UK liquidity. The UK did not go bankrupt. They did not go into a debt crisis. They needed temporary liquidity. Developing economies do not have that kind of sort of access to liquidity. So if you're a developing economy that needs to have a debt payment that comes due, and you cannot honor that particular payment, you go into a debt crisis. We call you a debt crisis. We don't say it's a liquidity problem. So we haven't created liquidity institutions for those economies. That's what the Liquidity and Sustainability Facility is doing, is allowing you to get that liquidity in those 30 days so you don't fall back. And this is really about developing the capital markets infrastructure that we need. The way I normally say it is that, we are now developing economies that are still, being treated as if we're rural economies. So it's like you have a Lamborghini and you're driving on a rural road. We need to develop secondary capital markets in these economies because we are now going to markets. We're borrowing from the markets, but we don't have the institutions. The United States, for example, has just created 2 permanent repo facilities to provide liquidity. $5.5 trillion of liquidity is exchanged every day in the United States to keep those economies afloat. So I think we need that, and we need to separate the liquidity discussion from the debt discussion. Otherwise, if we conflate the problem, then we have the wrong solution. The second thing, and we're sitting in India, and the title of this is Lighthouse in the Tempest. I think what we need also is really, and India can help us with that, is we need a solution for debt restructuring, both for low-income countries and for middle-income countries. As the poly-crises, and we have, I call them the 5 Cs, have happened, with every tightening of interest rates, we have $1 trillion more of debt to developing economies. This is debt that happens without anything being done in your country. You just get more debt because of the exchange rate, and we talked about local currency and external borrowing. What India can help us to do as leader of the G20, and this is the lighthouse in the tempest, is solve the common framework. It does not work. The comparability of treatment does not mean we need to do the same things. It may mean that we extend maturities on one bid. It may mean that we take a haircut on another. But I think the Indian government, and as India running the G20, can really help us with that solution. Because what is happening is that countries, yes, are facing payments, and they're making their payments, but they're cutting off on spending to health, they're cutting off on spending to education, they're cutting off on spending for girls and women. And so this is an important trade-off that we're seeing today. The other lighthouse in the tempest that India can help us do is we're sitting in India that is committed to net zero. It is, I think, probably the country that is developing the fastest renewable energy, solar energy, huge exchanges that can happen so that we can lower costs, we can provide FDI. I think you talked about knowledge exchanges. Yeah. Again, that's another, as we talk about climate change, we need to talk about it as development and prosperity. And I think India is showing that we can do that and we can do it well. And my sense is if we were able to begin to do both renewable energy, but put a price to carbon and allow for those carbon resources to be used for redevelopment, we may actually see an acceleration of prosperity on the continent today. And hopefully that we can do that with India's leadership in the G20.
Thank you, Vera. That sets the agenda for us very, very clearly, very, very clearly. Philip and Maria, I'll very quickly come to you with the same question. If there is one change that you'd like to see in the lending, borrowing ecosystem or the various stakeholders who are there, one change, what would that be? Philip, maybe we'll start with you.
I can think of 2 changes. The first one is that the world we are in is no longer the world that was described by Jenny when there was the highly indebted poor country initiative. It is a world in which the #1 creditor country, no need to mention it, must be part of any arrangement, because if they are not part of those arrangements, this is not going to work. Right. That's #1. #2, there will be a summit in Paris in June looking after the financial architecture, and I think this is a golden opportunity to put this on the table. France is working very closely with India on that, and I think the Indian presidency of the G20 will certainly help show the way towards the sort of restructuring we need to tackle the problems that we've mentioned in the panel.
Thanks, Philip. Maria, last one from you.
What I would say is also 2 things. One, very concrete, the special drawing rights. There was this issuance of special drawing rights in August 2021 in the middle of the COVID crisis, $650 billion worth of special drawing rights that went in accordance with the IMF key, very often to the rich countries that were less in need. So a rechanneling of these SDRs with a purpose that is related to climate action and supporting also those that are vulnerable to climate change, maybe not only least developed countries, but also the question of vulnerabilities, that would be one. And my second point would be a new way of having partnerships that is much more looking at sustainability, that it is based on quality, that it is not based on dependencies. And this is, the European Union has come up with a proposal to the world that is called Global Gateway, and it is very much based on this. It's based on quality, on partnership, on working together, and not on dependencies. So this type of approach that is much more open and very respectful, I think is what we need to see going forward.
Thank you, Maria. I think we'll open it up to the audience. Maybe it will take 3 questions. Maybe we'll start from there, from the Rechanneling fellows if they have any questions. Otherwise, we'll go to the rest of the audience.
Thank you so much. My name is Kirpir Chahal, and Jenny, you mentioned about engaging China, and we've also heard from Vera about the common framework not working. So in that context, given that we've made very little progress at the G20, and China is blocking progress, they've got their own demands for negotiations, they've got their own debt problem. We've now launched a new global sovereign debt roundtable. So I'm just hoping you can say a few words on why we think this roundtable will be more effective, what's different, how do you think it will be successful in bringing China to the table, and where do we want to be on this agenda by the end of this year? Thank you.
And then
okay, maybe another question.
Thank you so much for the panel. I'm Chamire Appa from Sri Lanka. So in the backdrop of the pandemic, Sri Lanka was one of the first countries to have a massive economic crisis, and that led to quite a lot of global attention. So this was tied on one side to geopolitics and on another side to a paralyzing pandemic. Both were like, unprecedented times, unforeseeable events. So what are the lessons learned in trying to manage Sri Lanka's crisis, especially with the dialogue that has been going on with China in mind? Thank you.
Okay, anybody specific you want to respond? Anybody specific you want should respond to this question?
I'll leave it open for,
okay,
for the panel. Thank you.
Go ahead.
Yes, hello. Okay, thank you for the great panel. I have various questions, but I'll choose one based on maybe on a reflection. There's need for risk capital, and particularly to get the concessional capital to allow to de-risk. But at the same time, when we think of addressing the infrastructure finance gap, the SDG finance gap, climate finance gap, etc., there's, for the past at least 5 years, we've been
confronting a very big call for private finance. So I wonder how this is going to be addressed or balanced, because on the one hand we keep hearing even from governments the call for the private finance, but the private finance won't go there
unless there is de-risking capital which comes from public sources. So any clarity on that or ideas would be great. Thank you so much.
Thank you. So Jenny, maybe you want to address the first one.
So just on the sort of the China and the debt point, just a few things I'd say. As I mentioned in my remarks, in the end, to have a successful outcome in managing debt distress in the current structure that we have, we're going to need collective action of all the major creditors, and that includes China. So that's the sort of principle, I think. As you know, there's been a lot of work in the G20, and China itself has signed up to the principles of the common framework. So it's much more about the implementation and the delivery of the commitments that have been made there. I think we need to appeal to China's stated role to want to be a constructive actor on the global stage, and its desire to do that. And I think we also need to appeal to its interests as a creditor. Something that I say quite often to my counterparts is that the long experience of the UK of being a creditor is that some of these things are going to go wrong. And when you have a significant creditor in the world, you have an interest in trying to make sure that you get to successful outcomes, because in the end you need to have opportunities to invest going forwards. I think we need to continue that engagement, and I think we need to continue to work with China on these issues. But I also think alongside that we need to make sure that we have credible and very large commitments of alternative sources of finance, and this is something that we've been working on in the UK with the G7 to mobilise additional finance to ensure that we have sources of finance that are providing that transparency and that kind of commitment to development in the long term. So I don't think we should give up on China just because we haven't got the right place now, but we're going to need to really work the diplomacy with them. Thanks.
I know Shubha's giving us angry looks, but the last question on private capital, anybody wants to quickly respond to that, and then we'll close after that.
I can do that.
Go ahead.
I think, thank you very much. And yesterday, Nick Stern talked a little bit about how you blend the different kinds of capital. The cheapest way of getting capital is good policies. once countries put good policies in place, capital becomes cheaper. But we also know that you need some philanthropic capital to start some of the more difficult projects. And then once you have the philanthropic capital, then you have some grant resources. Then the private sector can come in. And I think we have the commitment from the Global Financial Alliance on Net Zero, the G-Funds, as they call for $130 trillion. And they keep saying what we need are three things: good policies, implementation, and bankable projects. And I think once you have that, and you can blend, then I think it will, the rest becomes quite easy to do. But we need the multilateral development banks to put in that blending, the cheaper beginning financing, and to help with policies.
Thank you so much, panel. And Shubh, over to you. Thank you so much.
The moderators today don't seem to like me very much, but be that as it may, a quick 5